You're listening to RevOps Champions, a podcast created for B2B leaders to help you align your people, streamline your processes, trust your data, and leverage technology in order to grow your business. One of my most impressionable learnings from conversations with multiple guests on the RevOps Champions podcast in the last year was the power of processes, frameworks, and models. I, like many entrepreneurs, had to find out the hard way about the sanity and growth that comes with incorporating processes, frameworks, and models into a business. Entrepreneurs are typically better at creating new things instead of scaling existing ones. One example is why business operating systems like those developed by EOS and others have become so popular for small and mid-sized entrepreneurial businesses. Once a business knows how they provide repeatable value to their customers, the focus on operational efficiency and employee and customer experience become the pillars on which they scale and grow. To do that, they incorporate stronger processes and adopt frameworks and other proven models to make scaling easier. Let's hear from some of our guests from the past year, sharing examples of how processes and frameworks enable growth. This is what we see all the time, is that so when we start working with a new client, they think they're coming to us for a CRM, right? Which ultimately is what we need to deliver, but we cannot implement and deliver a CRM without being very, very clear about what their KPIs are. In other words, what we call their data. What is their critical business data, which is then also directly related to the processes that they run in marketing, sales, customer service. And then if we're integrating with their back-end systems, the processes all have to be very clear, or we have to guide them through potential changes.
Otherwise, you're going to fail, right? Because they don't know what's going on.
What's the problem that we're trying to solve? And so we need to make sure we're very clear on that problem, because sometimes it's easy to get enamored with the flashy thing that sits out there, and maybe it doesn't actually solve the problem that you have. So, for example, let's just I'll create one on the fly here. AI is all exciting, and everyone loves the idea. I have to have AI in my sales process. I have to have AI in this. Is that really solving a problem for you today? If it is, great. But don't just go out and buy a solution that has AI built into it just because it's the hot topic that everyone talks about these days. Make sure you have very clear problems, prioritization of those problems, and then think about solving them. The other thing to think about is time to implement. And I think this is another really big one. When you think about getting a new system and putting that in place, what's better? Is it better to buy a new system or to reconfigure the system you have, to build something internally? There are multiple options usually. You should look at each one of those options closely. The idea of buying something brand new, yes, it gives you a fresh starting point and you can kind of have this clean slate on the system, but it could take a long time to implement, train, all those factors. Reconfiguring what you have may end up being the better option, actually. And not to say it always is, but I think you really have to look closely at that. The buy versus build discussion is always one. If you have a big enough tech team, they might lean down the path of building something. I personally try to lean away from building. I think unless if you are a company that has a strong internal tech team that does a lot of this work yourself, then great. But lean on companies that know how to do this, where the expertise lies. And usually that's an external vendor. Or a third party of some sort. So I tend to, again, lean away from it, even though in plenty of scenarios I've seen internal tech teams want to do the build because they get excited about the idea of building something on their own. I'd prefer to buy. Going back to this idea of reconfigure what you have versus buy new. And I think that's a really important discussion and decision to make, because reconfiguring can work. And it usually is it depends on the scenario, but it could be a safer bet where you already know what you have and the known is better than the unknown. Because when you buy something brand new, there are going to be unknown challenges in that brand new thing. So again, I would really weigh both of those things, and I've made both decisions. I think back at SEMrush, for example, we opted to, and don't shoot me for this one, we opted to stay with Salesforce. As much as we all wanted to go down the HubSpot path at the time, it wasn't the right time for us. And we had a lot of buy-in, but reconfiguring Salesforce ended up being the choice that we wanted to make in a window of time. Now, that doesn't mean indefinitely. That's in a window of time. That was the right choice. But also, there's times where we said we need a whole new legal document management tool, and the one we had just wasn't working well for us. So we did go out and buy something new. So again, we've made both of those decisions, and I look back at HubSpot days as well. We've made the same decision, but we had to look at all three options: buy, build, or reconfigure.
Yeah, it was funny. Dharmesh posted something on LinkedIn yesterday that he just arrived in San Francisco, and he was driving to his hotel from the airport, and he was seeing all these billboards, and he says, it's the only, something along the lines. It's one of the few cities where all the billboards are owned essentially, or the ads are all by SaaS companies. And he talked about how he and Brian, that's what yeah. And he was saying he recalls how he and Halligan, like so many times, discussed, do we do billboards? And of course, HubSpot never did billboards. And I think it brings me to where you were going, the strategic planning aspect of all these kinds of decisions, right? So you and I actually commented to Dharmesh saying, because I learned this from Halligan like 8 or 9 years ago, strategy is as much about knowing what not to do than it is what knowing to do, right? And I think they would even agree with your decision at Semrush that strategically it made sense to stick with what you had. But bringing it back to where you started around the sort of business problem or the business objective, this is something that we are finding a lot of success with currently with clients and prospects and new clients, and that is sort of taking a 3-year approach. So this is what we have today. These are the systems. This is the data situation we have. These are the processes. These are the teams, etc. That's the current state. What does the ideal future state look like? And then being realistic about how long that's going to take. And we believe that a 3-year roadmap is still pretty realistic, because a lot of these things, especially as we go further and further up market, it's really, and there's only so much you can do in a year, right? So then what do you then push to year 2, and what would then potentially be pushed to year 3, and that you might only really have a better idea of in year 2. But it comes down to what are the priorities for year 1, and then what are the priorities for the next 90 days. So I love the way you position that by, let's start with the business problem or the business objective, and then kind of plan from there, and then you iterate, every 90 days. And the reality is that you're far more likely to get to the goal, over the 3 years than you would have been if you hadn't done that.
So shall we start with technical lessons learned, and we can get into process, because there's lots of lessons learned in my career. So I think when I look at on the technical side, the data set, let's start with data. That's foundation, really. And when I think of the data lesson learned, I think one of the things is, when I'll start more recently here at Semrush. Even when I stepped into Semrush, I realized our data was a little messy. And it's one of these things that I think I tried to make decisions based off the data before I fixed the data. And I really should have spent more time fixing the data and getting it really right, and making sure we had a good understanding of how to leverage that data properly. So it elongated some of our decision making. And we knew that we didn't have easy access to the data. We knew we had to do custom SQL queries to pull information. So my ops team was spending hours and hours building custom SQL for every request that we had, as opposed to having a very simple structured data set that we could pull simple queries out of. This wasn't complex ask, the types of questions that I had, but we just didn't have a good data structure. Therefore, you had to do custom queries. And I think this is where it's really important for a revenue leader to understand enough of the ops to be able to help the ops team make those sorts of decisions. So as I dug in, I began to realize why these requests were taking so long is because it was custom SQL that we were doing. And when I wanted to know, again, just a simple conversion rate, there wasn't a way for me to simply look, or even the ops team to simply look at that. So I think my lesson learned coming out of this is, number one, dig deep with ops. When they're taking a long time to answer questions and things that seem simple, there's a reason for that. It's not because the ops team is inadequate usually. It's because the system that they're using and the process that they're using can be a little bit inadequate. It's also, I think, empower your ops team to speak up. and say, here's a problem that we're having. We need to solve this to be able to keep up with the business. Because if the ops team is going too slow and the business is going a lot faster, then we've got a disconnect. So that was probably the other lesson learned is number one, again, obviously help them to solve the problem. But number two, really empower that ops team to say what they need and be very clear about what they need. So that was kind of very foundational, I would say, in terms of systems. There is another lesson learned here across a couple different scenarios. And I won't get into companies specifically this one. I'll talk a little higher level because I've seen it a couple times. But it's overbuying of software. And yes, exactly. Having a little bit of bloat. So yeah, you can very quickly and easily get enamored with the shiny object. And when you're not solving the core problem, then you're overspending on a variety of software. And I've seen this in again multiple cases. So I think it's really important to get back to that core problem, which we were talking about earlier. What's the problem that we're trying to solve? What's that core problem that we're trying to solve? And then make sure we've got the right software and systems. And it's not volume of systems. It's more, we might only need one tool and it can solve 80% of that problem. But let's make sure that tool is really good at solving 80% of that problem. It's very often very hard to solve 100% of the problems that you have. And if you do, you're spending a lot on technology probably to get there. And again, it creates a lot of confusion for the rep. Should I use this system or that system or this tool or that tool? So if you can really deeply solve 80% of a problem, then you're often in a better spot than trying to lightly solve 100% of a problem. And again, that comes back to just having one or two really good systems and investing heavily into those small handful of systems. So exactly, because complexity creates its own problems in and of itself. Another one, I'm kind of getting out of technology now, more into process, is the importance of a strong sales process. And I've seen this, I saw this at HubSpot, I saw this at SEMrush, I saw this in my early days, even back at Capital IQ. It's just creating that repeatable process. And the reason this is so important is when you don't have that, your ramp time is extremely long for the reps. And there's two ways, I think, of looking at rep ramp time. There's how long does it take for them to technically ramp? We're going to give them a 6-month ramp, a 3-month ramp. What does that look like? And then there's also how long does it take to get to a plateau of productivity? And I looked closely at this back at HubSpot. The ramp time we would give to reps would be roughly about 6 months. And that was very generous, and they typically would do fairly well during that ramp period. But there was a plateau that they would hit at about 18 months. And it was really important that they would overachieve once they got to that plateau. So yes, they would ramp in 6 months, but then there's this other gradual ramp that would happen thereafter for another roughly 12 months. And then they would hit a real plateau. So there's almost 2 ramps that were going on. And understanding that second ramp took a while to figure out. But then I realized we were missing out on opportunity.
Do you have the processes with a clear handoff from marketing to sales to customer service? Do you have the data and only the data that you need, not data that doesn't really mean anything, between marketing, sales, and customer service? And only then can we come in and say, okay, great. Now we can build a tech stack with the CRM at the center, which is then, of course, also your single source of truth, so that all the data and processes can be tracked through one system by all teams. And yeah, so we have to do the consulting for the implementation and the adoption, which again, for us is the most important thing to be successful.
I love to hear it. When the episode comes out, I'll shout it out to my LinkedIn network and certainly shout y'all out. It's funny. I'm actually about to head over to the Salesforce Tower. I just flew in to Salesforce. It'll come out later on this month. I'll be recognized as a Salesforce top sales influencer for the 4th year.
Wow, so, congratulations.
Thank you. Really fortunate. There's a company called Gridmate, which is a Salesforce add-on. They're part of the App Exchange. And they pretty much said, hey, we'd love for you to be an influencer to shout out what we're doing in the Salesforce ecosystem. Yeah, it's kind of crazy. I'm curious, do y'all host any kind of events? Do you ever bring in speakers or MCs for any events that you host?
Well, pre-COVID, we did an annual event called Dynamicon. So our company is Dynamico. The conference was called Dynamicon. but we tried it in 2021 as a virtual event, and it just wasn't the same. So we're hoping that it's probably not going to happen this year, but we're hoping that next year, we're going to do some smaller events this year to kind of test if people are going to come back in person. Because that event, we want to get to sort of 150, 200 people, in person.
I definitely want to reinforce that coaching is important, but we need those three components. And that's no different than what we need from our CRM, right? It's people, process, technology. One does not exist without the other. And in fact, they're becoming so aligned. I would also like to encourage everybody again to step back and look at your business. What are your goals? What are your KPIs? What are your tactics? And then make sure your CRM is aligned, and make sure any technology rolled out has a value proposition to the people you're asking to use it, so you get that adoption. Because without it, it's just another tool. And we all have plenty of those.
This is a good point, right? Because I see this all the time where it's like on the sales side, we might have a sales process and steps or stages in the CRM. Having a clear and agreed upon definition of what these things are just on one team is so important, because when you don't, what ends up happening is that you've got if you go from discovery to demo as an example, like when does that actually happen? And it may not seem like a big deal, but like what ends up happening if people aren't aligned, then you start getting these one rep has got an average days to close of like 100 days, whereas everyone else has got average days to close of 20 days as an example. It's like, well, why does this one rep have, why is it taking them so much longer, right? And that's just one example. Now you expand that to when sales hand something over to success, when marketing is involved, right? Like, and typically those are functions that live inside of different tools. And each team is getting better. They've implemented the tool, that they're using it. They've figured out like the right kind of like playbooks, and they're making their teams more efficient with it. And then, but there are these areas of overlap where the teams meet each other, and so you need to make sure that like there's everyone's on board and understands like how these things work together. And so if you're able to zoom out at the beginning and see how all this works, or the ideal state, right? You got to nail down what the process is, what the definitions are, so that when you are implementing everything, it gives you the best chance to get it right as soon as possible. I'm not going to say the first time, because it's like nearly impossible to get it right the first time, but as quickly as possible.
Like, what do you mean show it to you? Like, where's it documented? Well, no, we like, people sit over my shoulder for 2 days and then they learn the process. Well, that's like a game of telephone, by the time that it gets down to all the individual contributors and everybody's doing things a little bit differently. Truly document your processes. I promise you, it'll be more fun to run an organization when you can look around and go, golly, that's exactly the way that we want to do it. It's because we're following our process. It gives more confidence to the end users, to the customers too, as well. Man, these people are sharp. They know their stuff, but it seems like they're really guiding us through, or, that's an external version of a process. And internally, even as new contributors are coming on, we're onboarding new people, same thing. Hey, honey, how's your day today? God, it was great. It seems like these people got their act together, like, wow, the first week's filled out, the next month's filled out, like, and I'm learning stuff, and they seem like they're really aligned around what it takes to get this job done. I'm liking what I'm hearing so far.
Yeah, which we often talk about that example when it comes to, you cannot provide the best customer experience until you have the best employee experience. And that same person who comes home and says, hey, honey, this was awesome, at the Sunday barbecue or wherever they get together with their friends, where ultimately everyone, starts talking about how things at work. The person who says, oh, it's amazing. I've got the processes are awesome. They're not saying it in these terms, obviously, but and I have all the tools I need to do my job properly.
The new compensation model, all of those things are in the pipeline velocity bucket. Then you go further, we call it the customer time to value. And I'll go in one more, which is customer expansion. Those are the next two pillars. Customer time to value and customer expansion really focus on what we call is NRR, net revenue retention, because we all know if you're a RevOps person, you probably are very close to this. If a company has over 100% or 120% NRR, you know it's a healthy business. You know that your customers are staying with you. You know that you can actually take now bets in the marketplace because you don't have to always worry about acquisition. So that's what customer time to value and customer expansion is. Then RevOps, which is literally your area of expertise, is one of the pillars. We actually debated, Brennan, quite a bit to put RevOps in the center of the operating system to a pillar, because we believe that it's like the nervous system of how go-to-market should run. But we also recognize that the RevOps is good and important and is a cornerstone for a lot of the work we do strategically. It's also important to recognize that all these pillars don't feel like they are not as important. So we have to turn that into a pillar. And again, that's just through a lot of interviews and research.